I welcome our first speaker from the European Commission, Mariana Kotzeva, who's speaking on government statistical services in the data analytics age. Mariana.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Let me first tell you that it's a great honor and pleasure for me as a professional statistician to speak in front of you and to share what kind of efforts the statistical community across Europe has been putting in the last years. What are the challenges? Because we consider ourselves, I hope my colleagues who are the other statisticians in the room from ONS and the other colleagues will confirm that we are an important part from the government. And I could assure you that the question mark which is there could create a lot of discussion within statistical community as well. So I am happy to present to you the work of the European Statistical System, which is a partnership, as many of you know, by Eurostat, which is part of the European Commission, but also the national statistical institutes and other authorities across the countries. So less or more, I told you what is my intention, to share our experience, to share the challenges, and also to provide opportunities for you to find something interesting, what could be seen as opportunity for networking, as Anthony said at the beginning, as an opportunity for partnerships, or maybe you could take something from statistical work to the other parts of the government. So, like anybody else, maybe this slide is quite obvious for many of you. Everybody knows that we are challenged, and everybody is challenged in professional and daily life by explosion of information, by the right pace of development of new technologies, by different data sources emerging, and also the challenges posed by alternative facts, fake news, and the total concept of post-truth era. But for us, for statisticians, it's really a big challenge, because it's a professional challenge, because for many decades, even for centuries, we have been monopolists in providing information. We are immediate source for many people to go to the statistical offices for getting information on which the decisions were based. And now we are in a world where we are not the only one. And we have to compete with the challenges, and we have to find a way to remain relevant. So us, it's really a question of remaining relevant. And then one of the biggest challenges, although in the vocabulary, for example, when I was trying to be relevant to the audience in preparing the presentations, it comes in your vocabulary that we are providing as government services. But in the statistical world, you have still to change the mind, because most of the people are concentrated that we are delivering products, we are delivering numbers, we are delivering information. Of course, by doing that, we are delivering a service. But in these days, we have to develop more services, real services which are concentrated around information. And this is my first key message, that the biggest challenge for the statistical world is to move from providing just products, just numbers, to a number of services. And I'm going to speak now what kind of services and what, in this way, the contribution of statistical world could be to the general government service in the digital age. So what kind of services do our users need? There are 4 characteristics which seems to be quite straightforward, but to implement them in practice and to deliver in this way is a challenge. First of all, the services have to be user-focused and of high quality. Practically all services should be digitalized and in line with the government IT policies. I will come back to this point later, why I think that they have to be aligned with the IT government policies. Then we have to be agile and responsible, because we live in an age where we have evolving user needs. And then, as this links to the beginning of my presentation, we have to be visible. We have to stand out among other data providers. How do we make it happen? So now a number of concrete thoughts around this. One of the key challenges is to put users first and to know their needs. Again, it's obvious, but in the statistical world and in the digital age is becoming an issue because the landscape of users is changing. And just one example, to the set of traditional group of users, in this group, I would classify researchers, media, policymakers, institutional users. There is a new group of European citizens, or citizens in general, the public in general, nationally in Europe or internationally, who, empowered by the digital technologies, are becoming active users and real users of our information. So we have to consider them, to add them to the list, and to consider what kind of services we could provide to this group as well. And the challenge in the landscape of users is that they have completely different needs, rapidly evolving, and it's a question also of resource challenge, whether we could provide services which could meet all the users' expectations, or we have to introduce a kind of priority setting, and this brings even to the discussion what is the role of official statistics in the digital age in terms of whom we should first serve, should we serve all, with what kind of services, etc. And key to that is to use modern technology to trace users in a positive sense, to know their needs, to have a permanent interaction, and the digital technologies actually allow that, and also to be able to adjust when we know the feedback in order to improve the quality of the services. So just few examples. As I said, the European statistical system, all the national statistical institutes and Eurostat, including ONS, the UK Statistical Office, we are working together to develop common tools to share best practices and to build up online platforms for getting a direct contact with the users. We will open, I think soon, by the end of this month, online platform which will be accessible on the Eurostat website, which will discuss issues not only for the national statistics, but also comparison across the countries, what is the core of the European statistics. So then, what exactly kind of services we could deliver, what is under discussion, what is under implementation, and in delivering these services we could have talks with partners who are sitting in the room, or there could be questions, and we could work together in the future, or you could provide feedback or any kind of interaction with statistical offices. So there is a list which doesn't pretend that there is an order according to the importance, but just to enumerate some examples. The first one is that the users in the ocean of information, they need a kind of nudging, a kind of navigation. They need to be navigated to the trustworthy information, and this is a challenge. So this is, we consider this to be a kind of service to the user, a kind of service, and an element of the new role of statistical office to move from simply disseminating the information to communication, and from information to providing a knowledge. Then a very important element is to provide reusable statistics to continue the life of our numbers, because services, and this is an important element, should not be delivered only by us, but on the basis of our services, somebody else could develop good governmental digital services. And I will illustrate this with a number of examples in a second. Then the question is personalizing the service or customizing it. It's a topic for separate discussion because there are a lot of challenges around that. Then making most value of existing data. This is more linked to, I think, the topic of the conference, for example, government by algorithm, because there are a lot of discussion in statistical community. Should we move from the hard data, as we call them, from pure data collection, to statistics which are based more on algorithms, artificial intelligence, more modeling, and is this a deviation from our classical statistical function, more to the research? Is it our job? So that's why I think that the conference topic is very interesting, and statisticians also could learn a lot from the debates which are going to take place. Including open data, this is linked to the providing reusable services by statistical office. Of course, improving access to data for research purposes, and here I do not mean only technically, just for example, providing remote access, but also the word is, analytical word is more and more interesting in microdata, because also the technologies provide us more opportunities to have such kind of data, but we have many questions here which are related to privacy, for example, and even to have practical arrangements from European level point of view, from the point of view of Eurostat. For example, we have a lot of practical questions how to facilitate the access to data, because we are intermediary, Eurostat sitting in the middle. For example, like, how UK researchers could get easily data for all the from all European statistical offices through one single point, and how to arrange this in such a way that we respect the subsidiarity of the countries and also the privacy issues. And then the last one is the services which are underway. I know that UK Statistical Offices is doing also the first steps towards 2020 census for fact-checking and myth-busting services. Some examples, very few. One of this example is Eurostat's news section, which was opened at the beginning of this year. This is not a traditional news section that we release for the first time, inflation, GDP, etc., because this is classics. But we develop a news section which focused on topics which are important for citizens. Like this is, I think, from my colleagues took it a couple of days ago. But just to tell you that, for example, we try to follow what is important, like what kind of example, like ice cream. We have such kind of data, and in the summer people think about nice things like ice cream, they don't think about GDP and inflation. And then we put these nice topics there with data for the European Union countries and for EFTA countries, for all the countries which we have information. And then we make links to statistical products. And then what I wanted to show, what we call data multiplier, this, for example, for ice cream, there was such kind of reuse of this data. There were a lot of stories. This is an example from something what Bloomberg has developed. So this is the way to reuse our data. So our service is to provide the data, but then the other parts of the society could use this data to provide additional services. An example of tailored service, this is an achievement of European statisticians. This was done with regard to census 2011, where all the databases, data are physically stored in the countries. And then you have an entry portal from Eurostat website, for example. You could go from any National Statistical Institute, but from Eurostat as well, because this is in the middle. And then you go, and then you could order, let's say, request what kind of tables you'd like to receive. So it's a kind of tailored service. Then let me say that what is very important in reaching services, maybe nationally this is you cannot see this, but when we are sitting in Eurostat and we try to reach the people in all the countries, we realize that still communicating in national languages is extremely important. So therefore, this is a good question when we are providing digital services. Of course, by default, the digital service by the government are provided in national language, but the question is if you want to provide information which concerns the other countries, how you should do that. And in statistics, we develop common infographics, for example, which are easily translated in all 28 languages, so the statistical offices could in limited time translate the same picture, the same data, but just using national language. And the last example, I think, is that Eurostat moved from September 2016 to digital publications. This is also a kind of service, because digital publication doesn't mean just a PDF. Digital publication is to organize the data in a digital way that you have a content, and then you could click on different parts, and then you are targeted to different tools like interactive tools, graphics, text and databases, so you could play with the book. This is the idea for digital publication. We released 2 on energy and also on digital economy. So reacting on the user's feedback is important, and then I have just one example that concerning experimental statistics, that we have to produce new statistics on the emerging phenomena, and this is important also to have feedback at this early stage with the users. That's why I think we open in June, if I'm not wrong, because we are doing so many things, a new web page on experimental statistics where we present joint experimental statistics with the National Statistical Institutes, and we ask for feedback. All this is to make us relevant, visible, attractive, and customer-centric, to be recognizable in the world of information. My last slide is on the challenges ahead. To deliver all these good ideas and digital services, we have a lot of challenges, and this will be part of the discussion in the conference, so that's why my last slide focuses on this. The first one of them is development of appropriate skill sets. It's obvious, but maybe the related thing is that we have to change the culture, because the culture of the statistical offices should become to be service-oriented culture which puts the users first, and then all your services have to be focused on users, user-centric. That's why you have to develop way to communicate with users. And then again, should we reach all user groups, we have to have a kind of discussion, and it should be part of the strategies of statistical offices and of the government in general, what kind of services to whom. Then the privacy issues, I didn't speak a lot of algorithms because I think that, let's say, they are more people much more knowledgeable who could provide information on this. But also when we are talking about using algorithms, there are a lot of not only privacy issues, but issues of transparency. Because in statistical world, for many years, we have been working with transparency. We show our methodology, we show how we reach the numbers, and the question is when we are going to use more algorithms, how we are going to keep still transparency, because this is part of keeping the trust. And the last slide, the last sentence is that in the digital age, the statistical offices cannot work alone. For many years, we were self-sufficient because we did surveys, we discussed surveys with the statistical office, we tried to make comparison questions comparable, data comparable, but now we need partnerships in order to get the data, we need partnerships to develop further services, we need partnerships from the academia to invent algorithms in our daily statistical work. So therefore, I would like to finish with that, and again to thank you very much for the opportunity to speak in front of you, and then to call you for speaking with us, and we are open to do partnerships on different issues in order to make us relevant and to provide appropriate services to the different user groups. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mariana. I think what we're going to do is just check now whether there are any immediate questions for Mariana of clarification. If not, what we'll do is we'll collect the questions. We'll do the same for each of the speakers, then we'll collect the questions at the end. So thank you very much, Mariana. I think it's quite interesting to pick out a theme. Mariana highlighted the move from products to services. And she's followed by Heather Savory, who's the Director General for Data Capability at the Office for National Statistics. So I think there are two quite important words here. We've got services and capabilities. And I think that reflects in some senses some of the evolution in our world. And the title of Heather's talk is Better Data for Better Policy. And somebody with more knowledge about where the stuff is on this machine needs to come and rescue me. Oh, right, okay. No, they don't. I have the skills. Perfect.
Right, thank you very much for that introduction, and also to Mariana for her really interesting talk. For those of you who haven't necessarily been connected with the statistics profession, there is a huge thrust now to modernise, as Mariana's described, and this is not just in Europe, this is actually internationally. We're really looking to be more relevant and be more service-oriented. And this is very important for all of us because obviously, you know, a statistical office is independent of government and provides the information which should be taken to make decisions not just by government but by citizens and businesses as well. Now, before I get into my talk, I wanted to say a few words to Zeynep because I attended the very first of these conferences back in Cambridge in 2015, and this was a very aspirational thing for her to pull together. And that conference was a lot smaller than this, and basically most of us who went and presented were also in the audience. So it's fantastic to see how she's managed to grow this community and bring this valuable group of people together. So well done. So if you look at the conference programme, Zeynep has written a very nice introduction to this conference, and she talks there about the legitimacy of government to collect data. And that legitimacy is there because the government cannot run a country unless there is data to work from. Also, now we are at the forefront of the data revolution, so there are many, many different sources of data. We're not just surveying, we've got administrative data. For those of you who may not know that term, I hope you all do. That means data which is collected by other government departments or public bodies in the course of them doing their job, which we can now bring together and derive insight from. We're also looking at sources of big data. This means, for example, scanner data from your supermarkets or Earth observation data. So this growth in data means that we also need to harness the latest in technologies, including the very challenging subjects about artificial intelligence and machine learning. So the title of this conference, together with the question mark at the end, is very apt. We have to be really careful that we are working in the public interest and are open and transparent about how we're using, essentially, in some cases, what is their data. So I'm going to cover in a little bit more detail our approach at ONS and what it is that we're all at ONS across government and in the research community. What can we do with all this data? And this slide is trying to sum up the multiple opportunities we have, because it's not just about statistics and it's not just about research. There are actually, I think, 5 separate important categories that we can use this particularly public sector data for, and they are to get to better informed debate. You know, we need to get rid of fake news. We need to have trusted sources of data that the public will engage with. Some of the recent international events, I think, have highlighted to citizens that they do need to be better informed, and they shouldn't necessarily believe what they see on the news or the slogans or the sound bites which are trailed in campaigns to make them do certain things and think certain ways. There's also a very important role for data to run government more efficiently, to generate savings and generate efficiencies. And in most countries, including our own, this is incredibly important, that we not only move citizens to digital-facing services, but that we also deliver underlying services with better management information, essentially. The other part at the bottom of this slide is about innovation. Open data is the root of much opportunity for innovation, which helps economies to grow. And then, of course, the other two are around the research. So we'll really focus on those, I think, at this conference. But I wanted to set out what the really wide landscape is. Thinking about targeted service delivery, what's important here is that from a statistical and research point of view, when we talk about targeted service delivery and how we help underpin decision-making at the ONS, we are interested in anything other than the individual. So we are not interested in identifying you as a person. What we're interested in is looking at the opportunities that we have to look at our societies better so that we can apply our limited resources. So on the left of this slide, we're talking here about clustering. We're talking about demographics and geography and getting this to a higher level of granularity to support particular policies. If you're a policymaker, you will have a particular slant, whether you're in education, whether you're in health, whether you're in transport, and you want to know what types of citizens are using your services, and you want to be able to think about how those demographics may change in the future. Obviously, at the bottom left here, this is very high on our agenda at the moment at the ONS. This is all about migration. At the moment, I see some of you smiling. Thank you for your empathy. At the moment, there are confused and mixed messages about migration coming from different sources. So we are having a rethink about how we can measure migration better, how we can inform government and the public better. And this will involve bringing together different data sources so that we are approaching the question in a different way. This requires also close collaboration across government. There are some other examples on this slide, but I won't just read through. You can have a look at them for yourself. But I will say that the flow of funds is also a very interesting project for us. This is about looking at the ability to analyse financial markets better and earlier to reduce the risk of another financial crisis. So all of this requires data. And this is a really important slide for me because this is our thinking about how you bring this data infrastructure together. One of the key things that I've noticed in the big data revolution is that there are a lot of people working with, quote, big data. And when you ask what people are doing, everybody is actually, the growth in big data over the last probably 12 to 18 months, some of it, when people talk about petabytes of data, is because it is being copied from place to place to place. And we have multiple people doing some very interesting things, for example, with Earth observation data. But what we really need is to find a way that we can share this data better, bring it together, link it, match it, and provide support to answer different policy questions. So this is my sort of schematic of what I think our government information infrastructure looks like. You'll see there on the left-hand side, we have information coming from local government, central government, from the census that we run at the ONS, also citizen data and data from businesses. This somehow needs to come together in a coherent way, and the importance here is of this underpinning what is sometimes called registers, but I prefer to call core reference data, because it's the core reference data in these infrastructures which allows these disparate sources of data to be brought together to answer the questions. It's very difficult, as some of you will know all too well, to have two very separate data sources, and you spend a long time, I know, some of you, cleaning them. You know that you can do this analysis, but it can take an awful amount of resource, probably 80% of some researchers' time, just getting the data into a good shape to actually then start applying the algorithms and looking to see what that data can tell them. And then there are things that need to come out of this infrastructure. First of all, you need to be able to find data. There needs to be a catalogue. You need to have metadata that tells you what the contents of each of those data sources is. And we have to have appropriate security and access rights. At ONS, we deal with a full range of data. We've been doing that, as most statistical offices have, for many, many years. We do hold very personal data. We need that at that low level of aggregation because we need to be able to work out the demographics of the society in very different ways. We've been trusted to hold and use that personal data for many years. What we need to do now is to look at how we give better access to this data to more people, but in appropriate ways, maintaining privacy, maintaining the security of that data, and also paying strong attention to the ethical use of data, particularly when it comes to AI. So here's our challenge. Our challenge is to provide a single data estate. That doesn't necessarily mean it's all in one place. It means, thanks to modern technologies, this can be federated. It doesn't mean that, for example, if Mariana and I decide to share data, I'm going to have all her data or she's going to have all of mine. We have that wonderful thing called the internet to use, and we can set up secure remote access now if we do it very carefully and properly according to standards. So we have this estate of data of all these different types. And what we're trying to do is to provide different lenses into this data. So one of these lenses is for our own statistical production. This is in-house access, it's ONS staff only, it's people who are trusted to use your personal data and have been doing so for literally hundreds of years. We've also, and this is a big push behind this conference, is the Government Data Science Partnership. We've also built a data science campus. I'll talk about that a little bit more. But we're also looking at here allowing a very, very innovative uses of these data in a way which doesn't disrupt our production. So our challenge in modernising statistical offices is we can't stop the day job, and we really can't stop the day job. The Chancellor is not going to be very happy if we say, we're terribly sorry, we can't do GDP for a couple of months because we're working out how to do something else instead. So we have business as usual, which must be maintained whilst we try and innovate around uses of data. We're also providing statistical services. This is matching, linking and anonymising data for third-party use. And we have a very strong role here in supporting academic research. The Digital Economy Act gave us the power to be the accreditor for the public, for the research use of public data. And we are ramping up our ability to support researchers, which is a very, very important part of our agenda. And finally, we are thinking very hard about disclosure, third-party disclosure. So, for example, if academics are using data that we are supporting, we will actually check that data before results are published to make sure that there is no unintentional disclosure. I mentioned the Data Science Campus. Building the Data Science Campus was the pinnacle of my career, the most exciting thing ever, because it's on the front of our building in Newport and it looks like Google, and it's now full of bright young things, including our data science apprentices who checked you in, some of them this morning. And we're doing two things here. We are furthering, sorry about that, we are looking at data science capability for the United Kingdom at every level. So this is from apprenticeships, MScs in data analytics across government, and also looking at potentially PhD sponsorship as well. We have some of that going on. So we are working here in very firm partnership with academia, because it is also important that whilst we modernise the way that we approach the use of data, we all need to do it, as Mariana said, in collaboration. Now, you'll hear more about the Data Science Campus later, but I'll just flash up some of these. And this is the really exciting stuff. You know, this is where we look at alternate sources of data. And I mentioned tourism and I didn't mention tourism. I mentioned migration. We're looking here at alternatives to the IPS is our International Passenger Survey. So we're looking, for example, at sources of data like Twitter data to try and work out how people are travelling. I mean, you can through Instagram, for example, work out how many Japanese tourists are taking pictures in York Minster. There's some real insights you can get from data which is now readily available. So I talked a little bit, I'm probably running over a bit, so I'll try and speed up. I talked a little bit about the core reference data. The core reference data is essential for us to bring data together. And I wanted to just share two things with you. The first one is this address register, which we are building at ONS. Now, we can take the standard address register, which is used by the majority of government departments, which is delivered by GeoPlace. That's a collaboration between local authorities and the Ordnance Survey. But for the census in 2021, that is not adequate for us. As many of you will know, a very small percentage inaccuracy in that address register means that we will not have a satisfactory census. So we have actually been working together with these parties to develop what is a better address register, which we hope will be made available for use across government. This is an important and fundamental step in our being able to bring all these data sources together in a more coherent way, because an address is a fundamental identifier for many, many sources of data. The other piece of core infrastructure we're working on is the business index. We have this in what we call a private beta, and this is actually bringing together companies' house data, VAT data, and PAYE data, pay as you earn. That's our tax data. And again, we're using some really so state-of-the-art techniques in matching, to link and match this data, Elasticsearch, trying out different algorithms to generate a business index, which will be eventually will become a legal unit spine. So it's not just about limited companies. We also need to know about the self-employed. We want to bring in charities. We want to bring in other voluntary organisations, etc., so that an economic unit has an individual identifier. I've probably spoken for too long, so I will say thank you for your time and take questions.
Well, thank you, Heather. Are there any immediate questions of clarification for Heather? If not, we'll move on to our next speaker. And I think it's particularly appropriate that we both have a politician and that we have a speaker that addresses in this plenary session the question of trust, because trust is now, I think, woven into the whole issue of how we use data, and indeed drives down into the fundamentals of the technologies which we are deploying. So with that, I will again fiddle with the computer in a helpless way. One moment.
I don't think you're going to find anything, so don't worry.
That's good. In which case, bear with me a little longer. What I'll do is do that, and then that.
Well, thank you, Anthony, and thank you for inviting me today. I'm Daniel Zeichner. I'm the Member of Parliament for Cambridge. I was elected in 2015 and then re-elected a couple of months ago. I should say immediately to our international guests, I'm a Labour politician. I'm in the opposition. I do not support the government. I'm not responsible for Boris Johnson. So, and representing Cambridge, and there'll be many people in the room here today from Cambridge, which is fantastic. And I didn't realise this conference had started in Cambridge a couple of years ago, but that comes as no surprise to me. And I've taken a great interest in this since I've come into Parliament. My background originally, my first job was actually in Cambridge, being trained as a computer programmer in IT many, many years ago, when I have to say information technology, artificial intelligence, it was a world apart from where we are today. But I've maintained an interest. And when I came into Parliament, I pretty quickly spotted that everywhere I went, the data issues were being talked about. And I will talk a little bit more about the AllParty Group on data analytics, which I chair later. But that's why I'm here speaking to you this morning. It's always humbling for politicians to address audiences like this, because one thing one can say with certainty is that everyone in the room knows more about the subject than I do. But I hope I'm going to be able to explain to you over the next few minutes why I think there is a role for politicians to be involved, hopefully as Anthony has suggested. And on trust, you may well wonder why on earth you've got a politician talking to you when, as is all too often pointed out, in terms of the top of the league for people being mistrusted, I'm afraid politicians are right up there with journalists and estate agents. So, and, well, you can understand why. I'm afraid I will come back to this theme a few times. The experience last year through the referendum campaign, I quite understand why many of us are rating low in the trust league. It was not a great time for many of us, and I find it hard to forgive some of those. I keep seeming to go back to Boris Johnson, but never mind. And on tech in general, you can understand why people worry about politicians. Well, let's just say we hope the Home Secretary was poorly briefed when she got into a spot of bother about encryption a few months ago. But I suppose what I'm going to argue this morning is that For those of us, and I suspect everyone in this room is really enthusiastic about the opportunities that big data pose for us, maintaining public trust is going to be absolutely essential. I don't think that's a controversial statement. Possibly slightly more difficult to argue is the role that politicians have to play. Now, one example of where it goes wrong, most of you are possibly in the room too young to remember the debate around genetically modified foods 20, 30 years ago. Again, there was huge enthusiasm from the scientific community, and for a lot of people it just seemed basically obvious we could do these wonderful things. Why wouldn't anyone want to do that? And at that time, I think the failure by people who are involved in that industry to understand the public's perception of it very quickly meant that a lot of those opportunities, certainly in the early years, were not able to be realised because public trust was not kept. Now, that's not me saying where I stand on this issue. In the end, I would always want to follow the science. But I think it was an example of where if you don't understand how you're going to develop these ideas with the public, then you can run into problems. Now, we have this proliferation of data, and I think intuitively one's response is that must be good. We know more about the world. We can understand more about it. And as AI and machine learning becomes more and more sophisticated, what's the problem? And I have to say, one of the things I used to like about working in computing was that in the old days, when something went wrong and a program crashed, you got a huge pile of paper which you could go through, and if you knew what you were doing, you could find what the problem was, which was great. You could actually solve things. You could make things work. What I've learned about politics, I guess, and coming perhaps from a social sciences background, is that people and policy isn't quite like that. In a way, there used to be a sad comment on Gordon Brown that he was an analog politician in a digital age. Well, I don't think that was entirely fair on poor Gordon, but actually I think people are more analog than digital. And as some of us go back to analog in terms of our record collections and things, it's almost like a reflection on that. Now, I realise I'm probably stepping into dangerous territory because as we have some very learned people in Cambridge who are doing fantastic research into how our brains work. We even had a Brain Fest festival in Cambridge over the summer. It's the kind of place Cambridge is. But my sense is that human beings are a mass of contradictions quite often. Incredibly creative, emotional, sometimes indecisive, but from a political point of view, constantly capable of holding wholly contradictory views. And I suppose what I'm looking at is, on the one side, we've got data, which is, we ought to be able to interpret and tell us stuff. On the other side, we've got human beings. And what I would say is the data always exists in a context. There are always judgments and values behind what we use the data for. So how do we solve some of these conundrums? I'll make a couple of suggestions in a moment, but it does seem to me that we've got to keep our eye on that context. Just a few days ago in Cambridge, typically we actually had a conference on big data, how we might use it in our city to solve some of the eternal conundrums that cities like Cambridge face. And one of the examples that came up was a smart travel app, which is not particularly unique. People are doing it, obviously, all over the place. But the immediate response from someone in the audience was, well, just diverting drivers to an alternative route, that doesn't solve the problem, that doesn't solve the environmental problems. And it will upset local residents because there will be rat runs. And of course the point, it seemed to me immediately on that is, well, you can make some choices as to what goes in to that smart app. You can decide which to prioritise. Are you prioritising speed? Are you prioritising air quality? Are you making choices over which parts of the city bears the brunt of traffic or not? Now at the moment, quite a lot of that is done almost intuitively by people, but in a kind of not very organised way. But we will now have the opportunity, of course, to make decisions. But behind those decisions, whatever the technology, will be judgments, and there will be trade-offs. And I would argue that it's those trade-offs that are the stuff of politics. Now, we've already seen with big data that we've already got ourselves into some tricky areas. I only have to mention DeepMind, the problem that the NHS has faced with care.data. And the public clearly is slightly sceptical about some of this. Just in the last few days, we've seen with the Notting Hill Carnival, where there have been examples of face recognition technology. Fantastic technology. When I go and see the Cambridge companies that are developing this stuff, I get excited. But then I also wonder what my constituents are going to think about face recognition technology when the images are being taken quite often from CCTV data, sometimes custody data from the police. Not that, of course, too many of the people I go and visit are in those circumstances, but a whole range of places you can collect the data, not necessarily always with understanding and consent from the people concerned. So people worry about those things. Now, what are the solutions? I suspect there are people in some of the sessions you're going to have later today that are going to be able to talk in much more depth about this than I can. But I have to say I'm very impressed by some work that has been done by the British Academy and the Royal Society, paper that some of you may be familiar with. Ottoline Liza, who's a very senior member of the university in Cambridge, at the plant laboratory, somehow in her spare time has managed to chair this very powerful committee that produced, I think, a very good paper suggesting some key points, and I suspect some of you will be making reference to it. It talks about the context in which data governance needs to be set and warns about some of the points that I've already been making. And they do try and set out some overarching principles for data governance, which they say are needed to visibly shape all forms of data governance and ensure trustworthiness and trust in the management and use of data as a whole. Now, I think they probably had quite a debate about what all this should be for, and they came up with the overarching principle of data governance should be the promotion of human flourishing, which is quite a kind of flowery, kind of general sort of kind of aspiration, but I can see where they're trying to get at, that it should be used for a force for good. Underneath that, they have kind of 4 basic principles that data governance should be driven by protecting individual and collective rights and interests, ensuring that trade-offs affected by data management and data use are made transparently, accountably, and inclusively, seeking out good practices and learning from the successes and failures, and enhancing existing democratic governance. And they also suggest, and this is something some of us will be pursuing in Parliament, that to oversee the whole data landscape, we do need an overarching governing body. And they've looked at some of the other examples of other similar kind of institutions, and I think actually the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority is actually a particularly good example where some very thorny, tricky issues, I think, have been addressed and have largely managed to keep public confidence with them. So that's some of the areas I'll be looking at. Just to return to the AllParty Group, this was set up about a year ago. It has attracted a lot of interest and attention, which has been very, very pleasing. What we're trying to do is not just hold more discussions, because actually that people are doing that very well. But what we're trying to do is get parliamentarians interested and involved, because the truth is it's hard for people who are generalists to understand the detail. Now, we don't have to become experts, but we do have to be aware of the issues that people like you are raising. So we've been looking at a range of issues around fintech, around data and health. And we've got a series of upcoming events over the next few months on cyber security, digital identity, the general data protection regulations, and the use of data in elections, and quite controversial issues there. So to come full circle and to a conclusion, if you ask me, do most politicians understand the challenges we're facing? Well, I think possibly it's fair to say that some are dimly aware and some of us are trying, and that's why I'm here today, to learn from you. My job, I suspect, and my colleagues, is to figure out how to take the public with us. And I think we've got a huge opportunity in this country, and our National Health Service, an unintended consequence of a universal service, is a huge amount of data that other places don't have. And if we can use that data in the right kind of ways, that will be an opportunity not just for us, actually I suspect to benefit other countries too. But if it becomes tainted by doubts around privacy, if commercialisation creeps in, which is quite clearly is the issue that the public worry about, then we risk losing that great opportunity. And I think the only way we maintain that trust is through transparency, as already been mentioned. Inside that black box, the algorithms that very clever people are developing, it's got to be apparent to other people how those judgments I was talking about earlier are actually being made. What are the values behind them? What are the choices? And that is where politics come in, because not everyone will agree with those choices. That's in the nature of things. Some people will gain, some people may not. But if people can see how those choices are being made and can also see how they could be changed, then I think we've got a chance of taking people with us. And that actually is, in the end, why democracies have actually proved rather robust up to now compared to other systems. And that's why I think it's important that politicians and the wider public get to grips with this data revolution. I'm an optimist. I think it can be absolutely a force for good, but we need to get it right if we're going to do that, and I'm sure that everyone in this audience would share that view. So thank you for listening, and good luck with the conference today.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I think it one of the first steps towards public trust in some of the areas of interest to us is indeed that we are able to have parliamentarians like Daniel Zeichner speaking so articulately about the challenges. And I suppose it reminds me also that when I introduced this conference and said we are situated here in the heart of the policy community in Whitehall, I should also have mentioned that we are but a stone's throw from the Houses of Parliament, and for those of you who will, I think we're also a stone's throw from Boris's office as well. So what I'm going to do now is allow questions to the collective set of speakers. So I'll wander over here to this microphone and invite questions. While you're gathering your thoughts, I'll kick off myself with an initial a softball question, which is, can we have a 21st century data service capability with a 19th century policy making process? Yes.
There we are. Okay, I'm going to be brave and start with that one. The tradition of our Parliament, I think, is very important, and when it works well, I think it works extremely well. The policy making which underpins it requires a lot of research. So we have commitments in government now, for example, to public consultation. Now, some of the social media channels, which are part of the digital revolution, are actually really good if we can find ways to engage citizens better. So my hope is, yes, we can use data and we can use technology to actually get more of our population interested and involved in the policy decisions which are being made at a very early stage. But I will pass over to our Member of Parliament for a further comment.
Well, that's a $64 billion question, if I may say so. I mean, how you modernise politics and transform it in a way that you have an informed democracy, of course, is something which we would all like to see. But I can't promise you that's going to happen any time soon. And the job of people like me and my colleagues, I would say, is to try and provide a bridge between people who are involved in discussions like this and any street in the country, which if you go and actually ask any of these questions, the kind of responses you're going to get are probably fairly predictable. And we saw this, I'm afraid, through the referendum campaign last year. So without revisiting that, a lot of these things are emotional responses from people. Where they get their information from, of course, which sets those responses, we can do something about, in the sense that people rely on the media. The media, in turn, sometimes rely on information, which is why, actually, the points that Mariana and Heather have been making are so important, because if we can provide better quality information that people have trust in, hopefully we can move away from some of the really rather depressing things that we've seen, not just in Britain, but obviously in America and other places as well, some of us see them as depressing, and hope for a better politics in future. But I would say that you can't wait, because actually technology is going to move, I would say, a lot more quickly than our ability to transform our political systems.
My side, because I could bring an international perspective or European perspective. My first point is that, yes, the challenge to use the digital technologies and to improve the dialogue with the citizen in the decision-making process and political process is not only for government, it's for everybody. And just to give you an example from the European perspective, when currently, you know, that the European Commission is putting a lot of emphasis on providing actively involving citizens, for example, with impact assessment during the preparation of the legal acts, but this is also the same could be discussed at national level. And there we have discussion about using algorithms. Whether we could use algorithms to web scrape and see different opinions which have been provided in order to get insight from the any different sources of collecting opinion on concrete initiatives or legal acts, in addition to providing hard statistics, which I'm not going to talk about because this was part of my previous talk. But algorithms could be used there as well.
So, a second question, and here I'm drawing on anonymous, whoever you are, someone out there wearing a Guy Fawkes mask. How important is it that data leads the formation of policy rather than providing evidence for decisions that have already been taken?
Well, it's a subtle relationship between the two, isn't it? I mean, governments at all levels, local government and national government, are often accused when they consult people of actually having already made a decision and then building the evidence base to justify it. But it's a constant interaction, it seems to me. And in a lot of cases, people will come to an issue knowing a little about it, and actually in the process of that discussion will then acquire more data. The difficulty sometimes is people have already got entrenched positions. So, I mean, these are basic questions of democracy about how, and the trouble is, it often is messy, and sometimes it doesn't actually produce the right outcomes that you would conclude looking logically at the data. And that, I think, has been the entire thrust of what I am saying. We're trying to find a way of using this fantastic resource that we've got. But at the same time, I think one has to understand that for the vast majority of citizens, they're getting on with their lives. And I'll just come back on the previous point. I would not want to see policy being based on a search through the Twitter sphere, because not only you would get a very partial account of the world from that, and there's a whole world out there which actually isn't necessarily connected. And one of the things that people like me do is actually go and ask those people. And I would argue that our representative democracy is partly about that. There are whole sections of the population that aren't always engaged in the discussion. Now, that can sound quite arrogant, that somehow people claim to speak for them, but if people do not go and engage with those people and then stand up for them, we're in real danger of having policy driven just by the people who are engaged in the policy discussion. And it, just because that's available more widely through social media doesn't tell you the whole story.
Yeah, I think this last point is extremely well made. I quite regularly meet my constituency MP, who's Keir Starmer, in the pub actually. The question I'm going to ask is really about the generation gap. Sorry, it's an old thing. Most of us are from the generation that didn't have computing at schools and didn't even have computing as a degree. And then you say that the entire title of this conference is, has algorithm in government, and we know about government, actually democracy is a couple of thousand years old, I think. It was at least a version of it in Athens, but the algorithm bit is not quite so old. And I think the kids in the UK are going through a revolution, which is computing at schools, a millennium generation of grown up with computers and the internet. They get it, but it's obvious to me that if you want to explain something, I think the example of GM crop or GM food actually is a really good one, is that the lack of education in a domain is why you have a problem introducing a new technology, because you then split the population into a group that are aware of the tech and the generation that isn't. And so is there the question, sorry, to get to the point, is how do you manage that division in society? It is actually a version of the digital divide, but it's not rich versus poor. It's to do with people who've embedded the thinking, algorithmic thinking already. My kids are all grown up, but they're young enough that they actually totally get computing, even though none of them study technical subjects. They completely get it. And the people who are above that, that age point, and there's if you said to those people knitting pattern or cooking recipe, they might get it, right? Both of which are forms of algorithm. But you say algorithm, and you've lost them all. So what's the solution for government engaging in that and dealing with that somehow? Maybe you need to come up with government by recipe.
So the data derived.
Yeah, no, just go ahead.
Okay, so that's a long and difficult question just before coffee time. I think what we need to come back to is that technology is new. Lots of things were new in the past as well. Not everybody understands everything. And if we were putting together, the first infrastructure of roads or railways, there were probably similar debates about how this was going to affect our society. So the things that I think are important for us here, statistical offices being independent, informing policy to the best of our ability, even with the best data, the best evidence, we don't make the political decisions. So it's about informing, and government as a whole taking responsibility on behalf of the public for the decisions that are made. And that applies in this area as much as it has in other emerging areas in the past.
So maybe the new civics looks more like computer science and stats?
What I could add to the answer is that yes, we statisticians face this challenge of digital division or differences across generation in our daily life, because our first point is to disseminate the data, and if we are now we have the opportunity to develop all these nice visualization tools, etc. Most of them are placed on certain digital platforms, but we try to keep, and this is a challenge also, to even disseminating the data to reach all different age groups. And also another question, what I put also at the beginning, is that we have to navigate and we have to communicate. And again, this is another challenge to reach this different generation. This is something what is a question for us to address in our daily work, actually. It's a very, very important point.
So a last question from Mohammed Halabi. How do you get owners of various data sets to open up and share what they have when you have a culture of competition and politics that prevent that? I suspect a theme that might emerge in
Yes.
a number of occasions later on.
Okay, so we face this challenge on a very big scale at the ONS, because we are seeking to gain access to multiple different data sources. But I also did some work in this space prior to moving to the ONS, which was in open data. And through that work, what I have discovered is that most people who are reticent to share their data are reticent to share it for a number of reasons. One of them is that the data is not correct, or the data is not complete, to which my answer is there is no correct data set or complete data set. The other one is an assumption that people who have built data for their own use, that the community to whom they're providing it will not be able to use that data. We are often told it's too difficult, you won't be able to use it, you won't understand what the data means. That's really why it's so important to build this data science community. If you handed somebody a book, you'd expect them to be able to read it. We need to really up our capability and skills to actually get over that. But the key to actually sharing data better for all of us is that you have to do this in partnership. So the provider of the data has got to get something back which is of value to them, and that's one of the reasons that we want to work. We're working in a very different way now, reaching out across academia, but particularly in the commercial sector, working with some very big partners where we're not saying, oh, we're the ONS, give us your data, we need it in the national interest. What we're saying is, let's work together, because we can also help you if you want to do research which is in the public interest. We can help you build data science capability. So as with any relationship between a supplier and a consumer, there has to be something which is beneficial for both parties, and that's the way to sort of break down some of these barriers to sharing.
I really want to compliment, because thank you very much for the question. This is not 1 million, it's 1 million of 10 millions of importance for statistical work to get the right access to data. A couple of points. First one is that European Statistical Community, Eurostat and National Statistical Office have a number of projects, not only nationally, but also we try across the borders to have partnerships with owners of, like mobile operators, for example, to do research projects, to develop partnerships. Saying that my first point that it's very important to have these partnerships because we still have to learn a lot about the data, how to use them. Just one example. For many years we were aiming and still we think that we have to have access to individual records in order to do aggregate statistics. But in the world of machine-generated data and from our experiments and partnerships with private companies, it turned out that maybe we don't need access. We need just to give some queries to the owner, and then they could do for us some data processing, and then we could work with the outcome. So we have a lot of practical things to explore together. That's why the partnerships are important. The second point is that we have to address the issue of access in order to make the data sources sustainable. Because the demands for statistics, for official statistics to be a benchmark, is to have time series, to have consistent data across countries, across time. And in order to use these data sources regularly, you need a sustainable access. So this is extremely important question, which it should find also nationally, according to the circumstances, of course, a legal solution. And the last point is that most of the questions are related to trust, to how to keep privacy, how to protect statistical confidentiality. And in that respect, I could tell you that many people don't know enough in the way we are working. Because actually statistical offices have had access, I think you mentioned this in your presentation, for centuries, even for 1,000 years. Since the first census, we have access to individual data. And we have a system that we are not sharing individual data, we are interested in aggregates. But question of privacy is an important one, and building trust and showing that this data will be in a secure place is an important part of getting access. Thank you.
Well, I'm very conscious that we are eating into the time for coffee and networking, which I previously encouraged. So we have